sky screamed. Not thunder, not artillery. Something deeper, like reality itself grinding its teeth, while a cathedral-sized battleship tore in half above a burning hive city, its molten spine spilling into the clouds like a liquid sunrise. Sirens wailed too late. The air tasted like iron and ash, thick enough to chew, as millions of voices below blurred into a single animal howl. The ground trembled, not from impact, but from anticipation. Something was watching, something was waiting. And then, time stopped. Not slowed, not distorted, stopped. Flames froze mid-collapse. Debris hung in the air like forgotten thoughts. A drop of blood hovered inches from a soldier's cheek, reflecting a sky that no longer moved. Even the screams cut off, half-born. Silence pressed down like a hand over the mouth of the universe. And in that silence, a man walked. No armor, no weapons, no urgency. He stepped over suspended rubble, as if strolling through a garden, hands clasped behind his back, expression mildly disappointed, as though the apocalypse had arrived a few minutes too early for his taste. "Really?" he muttered, examining a frozen explosion. "This is what passes for drama here?" He tilted his head. The flames curved away from him, not burning, not even warm. The laws of physics bent around him like obedient servants. Messy, loud, predictable, he sighed. This was not a man. This was Q, and he was bored. High above the frozen city, beyond atmosphere, beyond reason, the warp churned. Even trapped in stillness, it noticed. The immaterium was not bound by time the way the material universe was. It bled through cracks, whispered through thought, devoured the weak. It felt Q like a needle dragging across its skin. And it did not like it. Something foreign had entered. Something wrong. Back in the halted world, Q snapped his fingers. The battleship reversed. Metal screamed backward, knitting together, fire folding into itself, smoke inhaling. The impossible became casual. Seconds rewound like a bored editor trimming a scene. The sky healed. The city stood intact again. The screams never happened. Q watched the restored skyline and nodded once. Better, still depressing, but less chaotic. He turned and found himself face to face with a man who should not have been moving. Golden light bled from his eyes. Not reflection, not illusion. Power. Ancient, crushing, vast enough to make stars feel like candles. The figure stood atop nothing, robes unmoving in a wind that no longer existed, his presence bending even Q's imposed stillness into something strained. For the first time since arriving, Q paused. "Well," he said softly, "that's new." The man did not blink. "You do not belong here." His voice did not travel through air. It arrived, inside the mind, heavy with authority, layered with 1,000 whispers beneath it. A chorus, a command. Q smiled slightly. "I get that a lot." The golden figure stepped forward. The universe resisted. Time shuddered, not fully breaking, but cracking, like ice under too much weight. "You are not warp," the figure continued. "You are not matter. You are not thought." Q raised an eyebrow. "And you're remarkably observant for someone glued to a chair." A flicker. Just a flicker. But in that instant, the frozen world twitched. Gravity surged. The air compressed. Far below, a single building groaned, its foundations screaming under pressure that should not exist in stopped time. The Emperor of mankind did not smile. But something behind his eyes burned brighter. "You mock what you do not understand." Q took a step closer, examining him like an artifact in a museum. "Oh, I understand perfectly," he said. "You're holding together a decaying empire with psychic duct tape, while 4 overgrown emotions claw at your reality from the other side. Fear, rage, decay, excess. Lovely neighbors, by the way." The warp reacted. Even frozen, it pulsed. Q's words echoed in places they shouldn't. The Emperor's gaze sharpened. "You see too much." "And you," Q replied, tilting his head, "see too little." Silence stretched. Not empty, not calm. Tense. Like a blade pressed against the throat of existence. Then, the Emperor moved. Not physically, but something deeper shifted. The golden throne, light years away, flared. Across the galaxy, astropaths screamed as a psychic surge rippled outward, distorting signals, shattering minds, igniting candles of sanity in an instant before snuffing them out. And here, in this frozen pocket, time cracked. A fracture split the stillness, jagged and violent, bleeding motion into a universe that should not be moving. Q blinked. Once. Twice. "Did you just—" The fracture widened. Reality screamed. And through that screaming gap, something else noticed. The warp does not sleep. It waits. It feeds. It watches. And now, it saw something it had never tasted before. Not a soul. Not a god. Something other. Something impossible. And it hungered. Q felt it before he saw it. A pressure, not physical, not psychic, but conceptual, like being defined by something else, measured, judged. He turned slowly. The crack in time was no longer just a crack. It was a wound. And from that wound, eyes opened. Not literal, not fixed, but everywhere at once. Colors that did not exist bled into shapes that could not hold form. Soundless laughter scraped against the inside of thought. The smell of rot, the taste of copper, the sensation of drowning in something that wasn't liquid. All at once. All wrong. Q's smile faded. "Now that," he whispered, "is interesting." The Emperor's voice cut through the distortion. "Leave." Q didn't look at him. "Or what?" The answer did not come as words. It came as pressure. The warp surged, not fully breaking through, but pushing, testing, probing the edges of Q's presence like predators circling something unfamiliar. The air, what little of it still obeyed physics, warped into spirals. Light bent inward, the horizon tilted as if the planet itself were trying to escape. Q raised a hand. Reality snapped back. Clean, immediate, absolute. The warp recoiled. For a fraction of a second, it hesitated. That hesitation cost it. Q stepped forward, directly toward the wound, peering into it with childlike curiosity. "4 of you, isn't it?" he murmured. All fighting over scraps of emotion. How quaint. The warp hated that. The pressure spiked. A scream, not heard, but felt, ripped through the frozen world. Buildings cracked. Glass exploded outward in slow motion. The sky flickered between colors that shouldn't exist. And then, something reached through. Not fully, not physically, but enough. A tendril of concept. Rage, hunger, despair, ecstasy twisted into something with intent, lashed toward Q. Fast, violent, hungry. Q didn't move. It struck him and stopped, like a wave hitting glass. Silence. Then, Q sighed. "Oh, you're adorable." He flicked his fingers. The tendril unraveled. Not cut, not destroyed. Edited. Rewritten into something harmless. A ribbon of light that drifted lazily before dissolving into nothing. The warp roared. The Emperor stepped forward again. Enough! This time, the word carried weight. Not just authority, force. The fracture in time snapped wider. The frozen world began to move, slowly, unevenly, like a machine grinding back to life after being forced still. Flames resumed their collapse. Debris began to fall. But wrong. Everything was wrong. Time stuttered. Motion skipped. Sound came in jagged bursts, half screams, broken impacts, fragments of reality trying to remember how to function. Q looked around, genuinely intrigued. "Well," he said, "this escalated quickly." The Emperor's gaze locked onto him. "You will leave." Q finally met his eyes, again, and smiled. "No." The word landed like a stone in still water. Ripples spread, not through space, through possibility. The warp surged harder. The Emperor's light flared brighter, and for the first time, the universe itself seemed to brace. Because something had just gone very, very wrong. Q clapped his hands once, and the stars flickered, not dimmed, not exploded, changed. Constellations twisted, light years folded like paper. Distant suns blinked out and back in, rearranged into patterns that meant nothing and everything. The warp recoiled. The Emperor's expression, unchanging for millennia, shifted. Barely, but enough. Q grinned wider. "Oh, this is going to be fun." The ground below collapsed. Not from impact, from absence. Gravity forgot its job. Entire districts lifted into the air, buildings tearing free, streets unraveling into dust as the planet's pull simply stopped caring. People screamed as they drifted upward, bodies twisting, blood floating in crimson spirals. The Emperor raised a hand, and gravity returned, violently. Everything crashed back down. The sound, deafening, bone-breaking, steel-twisting, the kind of impact that echoes in your chest long after it's over. Q winced theatrically. "Bit heavy-handed, don't you think?" The Emperor didn't respond. He was watching something else, something behind Q. Q followed his gaze, and for the first time, his expression didn't just change, it tightened, because the wound in reality was no longer a wound. It was a doorway, and something far, far worse was beginning to step through. The doorway breathed, not air, not wind, something thicker, wet, heavy, dragging against the edges of existence like a throat trying to swallow a universe that refused to go down. The sky above the hive city peeled. Clouds didn't move. They folded inward, collapsing toward the wound as if gravity itself had developed a hunger. Light stretched into thin strands, snapping one by one, leaving afterimages burned into the eyes of anyone still alive enough to see. And the smell, rot, sweet and suffocating, like a garden left to die, and then forced to bloom again in the dark. Q didn't blink, but his fingers twitched once behind his back. "Well," he murmured, voice softer now, "that's not standard behavior." The Emperor didn't answer. He didn't need to, because whatever was coming through that doorway, even he was watching carefully. The first thing to emerge was not a limb, not a shape. A sound, low, subsonic, a vibration that bypassed the ears entirely and settled straight into the bones. Teeth ached, blood thickened. The ground, already fractured, began to sink, as if the planet itself wanted distance from what was arriving. Then, a color, impossible, green, but not the green of life, not forests or growth. This was the green of infection, of veins beneath sick skin. of something spreading where it shouldn't exist. It bled through the doorway, dripping into real space like liquid thought. Q tilted his head, studying it. "Ah," he said quietly. "So that's one of them." The green moved. Not flowing, not crawling, deciding. And where it touched, reality gave up. Stone softened into something pulsing. Steel rusted in seconds, then rotted, collapsing into black sludge that hissed and bubbled with quiet satisfaction. Flesh, those unlucky enough to be near the spreading edge, didn't burn or freeze. It welcomed. Skin split open into wet blossoms. Eyes melted into weeping holes. Bones bent inward as if hugging something that had always been waiting inside them. And through it all, laughter. Slow, deep, patient. Q's smile returned, but thinner now. "Charming." The Emperor stepped forward. Golden light surged from him, not outward, but through the world. It lanced across the city in invisible lines, burning through corruption, sealing fractures, forcing reality to remember what it was supposed to be. The green recoiled, not retreating, resisting. Like a tide meeting a wall, it had no intention of respecting forever. "You trespass!" The Emperor's voice thundered, not spoken, but imposed across existence. The laughter deepened. And then it answered, not in words, in weight. The warp slammed against the doorway from the other side, pushing harder, widening the breach. The green thickened, coiling into something that almost resembled form, but never quite settled. Q watched it like a collector finding a rare specimen. "You know," he said casually, "in most realities, decay is a side effect. Here, it's practically a religion." The green noticed him. Everything stopped. Again. Not time. Not space. Attention. The thing behind the doorway turned, not physically, but in focus, and for a single, unbearable moment, all of that slow, patient rot looked at Q. The pressure hit like a collapsing star. Not force. Not energy. Recognition. Q's breath caught. Just slightly. And that was enough. Across the galaxy, something stirred. On a throne of brass and skulls, a god of rage paused mid-battle. Blood froze in the air around him, steaming in defiance of physics. On a throne of sensation, another smiled, sharp, delighted, curious. In a labyrinth of impossible futures, a third tilted its head, threads of fate tightening around a variable that did not belong. And here, at the doorway, the fourth, welcomed. Q exhaled slowly. "Okay," he admitted. "That's new." The Emperor moved. Not a step. A decision. Golden light erupted from him, not blinding, but absolute. It cut through the green corruption like a blade through mist, forcing it back, compressing the breach, narrowing the doorway inch by inch. The ground beneath his unseen throne trembled. Somewhere, far away, ancient machinery screamed under strain. The Astronomicon flickered. Psychers across 1,000 systems collapsed, their minds burning out like overdrawn circuits. This was not sustainable, but it was necessary. "Leave," the Emperor commanded again. This time, it wasn't directed at Q. The green hesitated. For the first time since emerging, it paused. Q watched that pause carefully. And then, he smiled. "Oh no," he said softly. "We're not done yet." He raised his hand. Not to attack, not to defend, to adjust. The universe bent, not breaking, not cracking, rearranging. The doorway didn't shrink. It expanded, quietly, smoothly. As if it had always been that size, and reality was only now catching up. The Emperor's light faltered, just for a fraction of a second. But in a war like this, that was an eternity. The green surged forward. Faster now, hungrier. It poured into real space in thick, pulsing waves, coating buildings, drowning streets, climbing the air itself like vines that didn't need support. The smell intensified. Sweet rot, cloying and thick, coating the throat, making every breath feel like swallowing decay. Q stepped back slightly, giving it room. "There we go," he murmured. "Let's see what you can really do." The Emperor turned on him. Not anger, not rage. Something colder. "You invite annihilation." Q shrugged. "I invite interesting." The green reached the center of the city. And then it bloomed. Not outward. Inward. Everything it had touched changed. Buildings sagged, their surfaces splitting into organic textures, flesh where there should be steel, veins pulsing beneath walls that once held wires. The streets softened, swallowing debris, exhaling a damp heat that smelled like life gone wrong. And from within that living decay, figures rose, not born, reassembled. Bodies twisted into impossible shapes, limbs too many, joints bending wrong, faces stretched into expressions that didn't match their emotions. Some laughed, some cried, some did both at once. All of them, alive. Q's eyes lit up. Fascinating. The Emperor didn't move. But his presence intensified. The golden light deepened, shifting from illumination to pressure. The air compressed. The ground hardened. The creeping corruption slowed, not stopped, but forced into resistance. A stalemate. For a moment. And then the sky cracked again. Not from the doorway. From above. A tear, clean, sharp, precise, split the heavens like a scalpel cut through skin. No rot. No decay. Just control. A different presence emerged. Cold, calculated, watching. Threads of possibility tangled in the air, invisible but felt, pulling at events, nudging outcomes, tightening around decisions that hadn't been made yet. Q looked up, and for the first time since arriving, he laughed. "Oh, now this is getting crowded." The Emperor didn't look. He already knew. "You have drawn them all." Q grinned wider. "I have a talent for that." The tear above widened. Something vast moved behind it, not pushing through like the green, not forcing its way in, but selecting the moment to arrive. Precision. Patience. And beneath it, a whisper. Not sound. Prediction. The future. Shifting. Q felt it. Not resisted. Not fought. Observed. His smile sharpened. "Ah," he said. "The planner." The Emperor's voice cut through again. "You do not understand the scale of what you have begun." Q turned back to him, eyes bright. "Oh, I understand perfectly," he said. "You've been playing defense for 10,000 years." A pause. Then he leaned closer. "And I just invited offense." The green surged again. The tear above widened further. The warp roared from every direction at once. And in the center of it all, the Emperor stood, unmoving, unyielding, holding back not one, but multiple horrors. Q clapped slowly. "Now this," he said, voice almost reverent, "is entertainment." The ground beneath them split open, not cracked, not fractured, opened. A chasm dropping into darkness that wasn't just absence of light, but absence of certainty. From that darkness, heat rose, dry, violent, burning the moisture from the air, turning breath into knives in the throat. Q glanced down. "Oh," he whispered, and for the first time, there was no humor in his voice, Because something else, something furious, was forcing its way up from below. The warp does not coordinate. It competes. It devours itself as eagerly as it devours everything else. But now, drawn by something none of them understood, they were all converging. Not as allies, not as enemies, but as predators circling the same prey. The Emperor's light flared brighter than ever before, not expanding, condensing, preparing. Q looked around at the collapsing, twisting, impossible battlefield, the sky tearing, the ground opening, the air rotting, the future bending, and for a brief electric moment, he didn't look bored. He looked excited. "All right," he said softly, then louder. "Let's raise the stakes." He snapped his fingers, and somewhere, far beyond this system, a star went out. No explosion, no warning, just, gone. The ripple hit seconds later. Gravity shifted, orbits destabilized. Entire fleets, light years away, lurched off course, their crews screaming as physics betrayed them without explanation. The Emperor's head snapped toward Q. "You endanger billions." Q shrugged. "Billions are just numbers," he said. "This," he gestured at the chaos unfolding around them. "This is unique." The tear above pulsed. The green below surged. The heat from the chasm intensified. And then, from that darkness, a shape rose, massive, violent, wrong, not patient like the rot, not calculated like the future. This was something else entirely, something that didn't wait, didn't plan, didn't care. Only one thing existed in it: rage, pure, unfiltered, endless. Q's smile faded, just a little. "Oh," he said again, but this time, it wasn't curiosity, it was realization. Because what was coming next wasn't going to play games. The scream didn't come from the sky. It came from below, a raw, tearing sound, like iron being dragged across bone, ripped upward through the chasm as something massive forced its way into existence. Heat followed it, not warmth, violence. The kind that dries your throat before you can even gasp, that turns breath into ash before it reaches your lungs. The ground around the opening blistered. Stone cracked into glowing veins. Rivers of molten rock surged upward, defying gravity, twisting into jagged spires that pulsed with a heartbeat too fast to be natural. And then, a hand, not flesh, not entirely. It looked carved from red iron, veins glowing beneath its surface, like magma trapped in veins that refused to cool. Fingers dug into the edge of the chasm, and the planet screamed, a low tectonic groan that rolled across continents. Q didn't move, but his eyes narrowed. "There you are." The Emperor's light intensified. Not outward, inward, condensing around him, tightening, preparing, like a blade being drawn slowly from its sheath. "Withdraw," the Emperor commanded. Not a request, not a warning. A final line. Q tilted his head slightly. "And miss this?" The hand pulled. Reality tore. A second hand slammed onto the surface, cracking the city's foundation like glass under pressure. Entire districts collapsed inward as the thing beneath forced its way up. Stone, steel, and bone shattering under its ascent. The heat became unbearable. Skin blistered, eyes dried. Even the air seemed to recoil, thinning as if it didn't want to exist near whatever was emerging. And then it rose. Not fully, not yet, but enough. A shape formed, towering, vast, wrapped in an aura of violence so intense it bent the space around it. Not distortion, submission, The world itself seemed to lean away from it, as if trying to escape something it knew it couldn't outrun. The sound changed. The subsonic hum from before deepened into a pulse, a rhythm that didn't match any heartbeat. Too fast, too chaotic, too hungry. Q's smile flickered. "You're louder than the others," the thing answered. Not with words, with impact. It surged upward, faster than something that size should be able to move. The shockwave hit before it even fully emerged, an invisible hammer that slammed into the city, flattening structures, sending debris into the air in a violent outward ring. Windows exploded, metal screamed, bodies, those still intact, were thrown like discarded dolls. Q raised a hand. The shockwave stopped, mid-expansion, frozen like a ripple in glass. He studied it, curious. Interesting physics. Behind him, the Emperor moved. Not a step, a shift. Golden light erupted outward, not gentle, not controlled, absolute. It collided with the frozen shockwave, shattering it into fragments of motion that dissolved into nothing before they could complete their destruction. The emerging figure noticed. Its head, if it could be called that, turned, and for a moment, the world held its breath, because this was not decay, not manipulation, not excess. This was war, pure, eternal, unrelenting, and it had just found something worth fighting. The warp convulsed, not in harmony, in competition. The green corruption thickened, reacting to the heat with a sickening eagerness, decay thriving in destruction. The tear in the sky pulsed faster, threads of possibility tightening, adjusting, recalculating every outcome in real time. And now, rage had arrived. Fully, the figure pulled itself free from the chasm with a final violent motion, dragging reality with it like chains snapping under strain. It stood, towering over the ruined city. Massive, armored in something that looked like metal, but felt like violence made solid. Every surface was jagged, unfinished, like it had been forged mid-battle and never allowed to cool. Its presence burned. Not heat alone. Intent. Q exhaled slowly. "All right," he said. "Now we're talking." The Emperor stepped forward. Between Q and the thing, a line drawn, unbreakable. "You will not advance." The response came instantly. Not hesitation, not thought. The creature moved. A single step, and the ground shattered, not cracked, disintegrated. Pulverized into dust that vaporized before it could settle. The Emperor's light surged to meet it. Golden against red. Order against fury. The collision didn't explode. It compressed. For a fraction of a second, everything collapsed inward toward the point of impact. Light bent. Sound vanished. Gravity inverted. And then, release. The blast tore outward in every direction, flattening what little remained of the city, carving a perfect, expanding circle of devastation that stretched to the horizon in seconds. Q stood untouched at the center, watching, always watching. "Stage 2, he murmured under his breath. The Emperor didn't retreat, didn't falter, but the ground beneath him sank slightly, just enough to show that even he felt the pressure. The creature stepped again, closer, every movement rewriting the battlefield, heat waves distorting the air, shock waves cracking the sky, the smell of burning reality filling the senses. Q leaned forward slightly. "Come on," he whispered, almost excited. "Show me." The creature obliged. It raised its arm and brought it down. Not a strike, a statement. The air itself ignited. Not fire, force. A downward cascade of raw impact that crushed everything beneath it. turning space into a weapon, driving pressure so intense it bent the horizon. The Emperor met it head-on. Golden light erupted upward, colliding with the descending force in a blinding explosion that swallowed both figures for a heartbeat. The sound wasn't a sound. It was absence. A moment where the universe forgot how to be. And then it remembered. Violently. The explosion tore upward, ripping a hole in the sky that stretched into orbit. Clouds vaporized, satellites shattered, debris rained down like burning rain. Q laughed, not loudly, but genuinely. "Yes," he said, "that's more like it." The green corruption surged again, feeding on the destruction, expanding faster now, consuming what the battle left behind. Twisted forms rose in its wake, new, stronger, more unstable. The tear above widened further, threads tightening, pulling at the battle, guiding it toward outcomes unseen. Everything was escalating, exactly as it should. Exactly as Q wanted. The Emperor emerged from the blast, unbroken, but different. The light around him had changed. Less radiant, more focused, sharper, like a weapon honed to its limit. "You end this," he said, voice cutting through the chaos. Q raised an eyebrow. "Why would I do that?" The creature didn't wait. It lunged, faster than before, closing the distance in an instant, its massive form moving with impossible speed, driven by nothing but the need to destroy. The Emperor met it. Their clash was immediate. No build-up. No hesitation. Golden light and red fury collided again, each strike sending shockwaves across the planet, each impact rewriting the battlefield in their wake. Mountains in the distance crumbled. Oceans shifted. The planet's rotation stuttered. Q watched it all, eyes gleaming. But then, something changed. Not in the battle. In him. A flicker. Brief. But real. Because beneath the chaos, beneath the noise, he felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Resistance. Not just physical. Not just conceptual. Something deeper. This universe was pushing back. Q's smile faded slightly. "Huh." The creature roared. Again, not sound, but force, and slammed both hands down toward the Emperor. The impact missed. Not by distance. By choice. The Emperor wasn't there anymore. He was above. Golden light condensed into a single point. And then, it struck. A beam of pure psychic force lanced downward, hitting the creature square in its core, driving it back, forcing it to one knee. The ground collapsed beneath it. For a moment, it held. For a moment, it faltered. Q's eyes narrowed. "Now that's new," the creature growled. Low, dangerous. And then, it laughed. A sound like grinding metal and breaking bones. It stood, unaffected. The beam shattered against it, dissolving into nothing. The Emperor's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes tightened. Q exhaled slowly. "Okay," he admitted. "That's a problem." The green surged closer. The tear above pulsed faster. The battlefield twisted further out of control. And then, the creature turned, not toward the Emperor, toward Q. Everything stopped again. Not time, not motion, focus. Q felt it. That pure, unfiltered rage locked onto him, measured him, decided. Q smiled. But this time, it wasn't playful. "Oh," he said quietly, because for the first time since arriving, he wasn't just observing. He was the target. The creature stepped forward. The ground disintegrated beneath its feet. The air ignited. The warp howled. And Q didn't move. The moment stretched. Not time, intent. Every atom in the air seemed to hesitate, caught between obedience and annihilation, as the thing of rage took another step toward Q. The ground didn't crack this time. It simply ceased, erased beneath its weight, leaving a hollow void that sucked heat and sound into nothingness. The sky dimmed. Not clouds, not smoke. Something deeper, like the stars themselves were pulling back, unwilling to witness what came next. Q stood still. Hands behind his back, head tilted slightly, and for the first time since he had arrived, he did not look amused. "All right," he said quietly. "You've made your point." The creature answered with motion. It lunged. No warning, no build-up, just pure, instantaneous violence, closing the distance in less than a thought. Its massive arm carving through space with a force that bent light around it. Q raised one finger. The strike stopped. Not blocked, not slowed. Stopped. Frozen inches from his face, the creature's arm trembled, not from weakness, but from resistance it had never encountered before. The air screamed. Not from impact, from contradiction. Q's eyes met the thing's burning gaze. "Now it's my turn." He flicked his finger, and the creature moved, not backward, sideways. Reality shifted around it, relocating its position by a fraction of existence. Not distance, not time, but context. Its attack landed somewhere else, nowhere, a place that didn't exist long enough to be destroyed. The shockwave still came. Delayed. Wrong. It tore through the empty air behind Q, ripping open a canyon that stretched for kilometers before collapsing in on itself with a thunderclap that arrived seconds too late. The creature staggered. Just slightly. Confusion, not emotion, but disruption, rippled through its form. Q stepped forward. Calm. Precise. Curious again. "Let's test something," he murmured. He snapped his fingers. The world inverted. Up became sideways. Gravity twisted into a spiral. The horizon folded into itself like paper being crushed in an invisible hand. Entire chunks of the planet lifted and rotated, dragging oceans into the sky in towering columns of water that shimmered with reflected fire. The creature didn't fall, didn't stumble. It adapted. Instantly. It moved through the warped space as if it had always been designed for it, each step recalibrating to a reality that refused to stay consistent. Q's eyebrows rose. "Adaptive," he noted. Behind them, the Emperor watched, still, silent, but not idle. The golden light around him had changed again. It was no longer expanding or condensing. It was focusing, drawing inward, sharpening, compressing into something that felt less like illumination and more like inevitability. Q glanced at him briefly. "Planning something?" No answer. Only pressure. The kind that builds before a star collapses. Q looked back at the creature. "Let's push a little harder." He raised both hands and clapped. Once. The sound didn't echo. It erased. For a split second, everything went silent. Not absence of noise, but absence of possibility. A gap where cause and effect forgot how to connect. Then, reality snapped. The creature was no longer standing. It was falling. Not down. Not up. Through. Layers of existence peeled back beneath it, dimensions collapsing in sequence as it dropped through them, each one shattering like glass under pressure. The warp howled. The green corruption recoiled. The tear above flickered violently, threads of fate snapping and reweaving at impossible speeds. Q watched, satisfied. Let's see how you handle that. For a moment, it worked. The creature vanished into the collapsing layers, its presence stretched thin, diluted across fragments of reality that couldn't sustain it. The battlefield breathed. A brief, fragile pause. And then, the pause broke, violently. The layers exploded outward. Not collapsing, rejecting. The creature returned. Not weakened, not damaged, angrier. It tore back into the primary reality like a blade ripping through fabric, dragging shards of broken dimensions with it. Each fragment burned, screaming as it dissolved into nothing, unable to survive the intensity of its re-entry. Q's smile tightened. "All right," he admitted, "you're persistent." The creature didn't respond. It attacked, faster, harder. Its next strike wasn't aimed at Q. It was aimed at everything. A sweeping arc of pure destruction that didn't just target a point, but a concept. Space itself cracked along the path of the strike, splitting open into jagged voids that swallowed light, sound, and matter indiscriminately. Q reacted. Finally, he stepped sideways and wasn't there anymore. The attack passed through the space he had occupied, tearing a hole in the world that refused to close, a wound in reality that bled nothingness into existence. Q reappeared behind the creature. "Impressive," he said, "but a bit unfocused." He raised his hand again and paused, because something else shifted. The Emperor moved, not physically, completely. The golden light vanished, not dimmed, gone. For a fraction of a second, the battlefield was plunged into something deeper than darkness, a void where even the warp hesitated to exist. Q turned sharply. Oh, and then the light returned, different. Not radiant, not expansive, singular. A single point of blinding, absolute intensity formed where the Emperor stood. A star compressed into human shape, its edges razor sharp, its presence bending everything around it into alignment. The air screamed. The ground knelt. Even the warp paused. The creature turned. For the first time, it hesitated. Q's expression shifted. Not amusement, not curiosity, recognition. "Now that," he whispered, "is new." The Emperor spoke. One word. Enough. And the universe listened. The point of light expanded, not outward, but through. It passed through the battlefield like a wave that didn't move, rewriting everything it touched into something more ordered. The green corruption burned away, screaming as it was forced back into the warp. The tear above sealed partially, threads snapping as futures collapsed into a single enforced path. Even the creature was pushed, not destroyed, not defeated, resisted. For the first time since its arrival, it was forced to take a step back. The planet stabilized. Gravity returned. The sky held. Q watched it all, silent. Then he laughed. Soft at first, then louder, then genuine. "There it is," he said, eyes gleaming. "I was wondering when you'd stop holding back." The Emperor didn't respond, but the light intensified further. Strain showed, not in his expression, in the world. Across the galaxy, psychers screamed as their connection to the warp twisted under the pressure. The Astronomicon flickered wildly, its beam stuttering like a failing heartbeat. This could not last. Q saw it, understood it instantly. and smiled. "Ah," he said, "there's the limit." The creature roared again, pushing against the golden force, its rage colliding with the Emperor's will in a clash that tore at the edges of reality. The balance was breaking. Q stepped forward. Between them, the light pressed against him. The rage burned around him, and he ignored both. "You know," he said casually, "this is all very dramatic, very apocalyptic. Love the aesthetic." He raised a hand. The golden light faltered. Just slightly. The creature surged. The balance tipped. The Emperor's gaze snapped to Q. "You will undo this." Q met his eyes and smiled. "No." He snapped his fingers. Everything stopped. Again. But this time, it wasn't clean. The freeze was imperfect, fractured, unstable, bleeding at the edges as forces too large resisted being held. The Emperor moved within it, barely. The creature strained, almost breaking free. Q looked between them, and for the first time, he didn't look in control. He looked challenged. "Now this," he whispered, "is interesting." The warp surged. All four presences converging. The doorway reopened. The sky cracked. The ground split. And something else, something far worse, shifted in the distance. Not here, not yet, but coming. Q felt it, turned slowly, and his smile, finally, faded. "Oh," he said quietly, because whatever was approaching wasn't part of the game he started. The stars didn't go out. They looked away. One by one, pinpricks of distant fire dimmed, not extinguished, but withdrawing, as if the galaxy itself refused to witness what was arriving. The sky above the shattered world turned hollow, a vast watching void where constellations once held their ground. And in that emptiness, something blinked, not light, absence. Q felt it before he saw it, a pressure that didn't push, didn't crush. It questioned his existence, his rules, his very right to stand where he stood. For the first time since stepping into this universe, Q did not smile. "That's not warp," he said under his breath. The frozen battlefield trembled, not with motion, but with rejection. The Emperor's golden singularity flickered, strained under a force that wasn't attacking it, just denying it. Even the creature of rage, still caught between movement and stillness, stilled further, its violent aura compressing, shrinking, like a flame forced into a sealed container. Something worse than chaos had entered the equation, something that did not care for emotion, something that did not feel. Far beyond the broken world, beyond the warp's bleeding edges, beyond even the Emperor's psychic reach, a silence spread, not the absence of sound, the absence of thought. Entire star systems dimmed, not visually, but conceptually. Minds went quiet. Billions of sentient beings froze mid-action, their thoughts gone, not erased, not destroyed, paused. Ships drifted without guidance. Planets rotated without purpose. The galaxy itself seemed to forget why it was moving. And in that vast, suffocating quiet, it came closer. Back on the battlefield, Q exhaled slowly. "Oh, I don't like that." He raised his hand, stopped, because for the first time in his existence, his power didn't respond instantly. Not blocked, not resisted, just delayed, a fraction of a second. But to something like Q, that was an eternity. His eyes narrowed. "Now that's new." The Emperor felt it too. The golden light around him sharpened, condensing even further, pushing against the encroaching silence with everything he had left. But the silence didn't fight back. It didn't surge. It didn't roar. It simply continued, indifferent, inevitable. "You have summoned extinction," the Emperor said, his voice quieter now, not weaker, but measured. Q glanced at him. "Oh, don't be dramatic," he replied, though the edge in his tone betrayed him. "Extinction is so final." The Emperor didn't respond, because the thing approaching was. The warp reacted next, not as one, never as one. The green corruption recoiled violently, retreating toward the edges of the battlefield, its bloated growths shriveling as if exposed to a vacuum that devoured not matter, but meaning. The tear in the sky convulsed, threads of fate snapping like overstressed wires, futures collapsing faster than they could be recalculated. Even the rage, the pure, unstoppable force of destruction, hesitated. Not fear, not caution, something more primal, interruption. The creature's burning aura dimmed, not extinguished, but muted. Its movement slowed, its presence compressed under a weight it could not strike, could not destroy, could not even touch. Q watched all of it, and for the first time, he stepped back. "All right," he admitted quietly. "Who invited that?" No answer, only silence. The sky tore again, not like before. No colors, no corruption. Just a clean surgical opening. A perfect circle of nothing that cut through reality without resistance, without distortion. No sound, no heat, no smell. Just absence. And from that absence, a shape descended. Not massive, not towering, small, precise, perfectly defined. A figure composed of shifting geometry, angles that didn't quite align, edges that blurred and sharpened in the same instant. It didn't glow. It didn't radiate power. It simply was. And its existence alone silenced everything. The warp fell quiet. The creature of rage stopped moving. The Emperor's light flickered, struggling to maintain its form against something that didn't oppose it, but simply overrode it. Q stared, longer than he ever had at anything before. "You're not supposed to be here," he said slowly. The figure didn't respond, didn't move, didn't acknowledge him, and somehow, that was worse. A single step. That's all it took. The figure touched the battlefield, and the world changed. Not violently, not explosively, absolutely. The ground beneath it became correct, cracks sealed, corruption vanished, heat dissipated. Even the air stabilized, returning to a state it had long forgotten. Perfection, cold, clean, unyielding. The effect spread outwards in a perfect circle, rewriting everything it touched into a version of reality that made sense. The green corruption shrieked, silently, as it was erased, not pushed back into the warp, but removed entirely from the equation. The tear above sealed instantly, threads of fate snapping into a single fixed outcome. The creature of rage was forced to its knees, not by force, by irrelevance. Its existence didn't fit, and so it was corrected. Q's breath hitched, just slightly. "Oh," he whispered, because this wasn't power, not in any way he understood. This was authority. The Emperor moved, not aggressively, not defensively, carefully. "You are not of this galaxy," he said, his voice carrying a weight that had broken gods. The figure didn't respond, but something shifted, a focus. Not on the Emperor, on Q. Q felt it immediately. That same questioning pressure, now direct, precise, invasive, measuring him, analyzing him, defining him. For the first time, Q flinched. "Hey," he said, raising a hand. "Personal space. No effect." The pressure increased. Not painful, not damaging, but intrusive. Like being reduced to data. Q's smile returned, but it was forced now. "All right," he said, voice sharper. "That's enough." He snapped his fingers. Reality obeyed. The figure disappeared. Gone. Erased from the battlefield. Q exhaled. There we go. Silence. A heartbeat. 2. Then, the figure reappeared. In the exact same position. Unchanged. Untouched. Unbothered. Q's expression cracked. Just for a second. "Okay," he said slowly. "That's a problem." The Emperor watched closely. For the first time since Q's arrival, he was not the most powerful presence here, and he knew it. "You cannot control it," the Emperor said. Q didn't look at him. "I can control everything," he replied. But there was hesitation. Barely there, but real. The figure took another step. The circle of correction expanded further. The battlefield shrank. Chaos collapsed inward. Everything that didn't fit was removed. The creature of rage roared, its sound muted, its power suppressed, its very existence struggling to remain defined. The warp recoiled entirely, retreating beyond the edges of perception. And Q felt it again, that delay, that fraction of a second where his will wasn't absolute. His eyes narrowed. "You're rewriting the rules," he said. No response. Only continuation. The figure raised one hand. Not dramatic, not aggressive, simple, efficient. And Q stopped moving, not frozen, not held, paused. His thoughts continued. His awareness remained, but his body did not respond. For the first time in his existence, Q was not in control of himself. "That's new," he whispered. The Emperor's gaze sharpened. "You have brought judgment upon yourself." Q didn't answer, because he was busy doing something he had never needed to do before. Trying, pushing, straining against something that didn't fight him, just defined him out. The figure stepped closer, each movement precise, inevitable, unstoppable. And as it approached, Q felt something else, something deeper than resistance. Not fear, not yet, but the possibility of it. "No," he said quietly. His voice cracked the stillness. Just slightly, but enough. The universe trembled. Q's eyes burned with something new. Not amusement, not curiosity, determination. "No," he repeated. And this time, reality shook. Far beyond the battlefield, the stars that had looked away turned back, because something impossible was about to happen. The silence shattered, not with sound, but with defiance. Q's fingers twitched. A microscopic movement. A rebellion so small it shouldn't have mattered. Except here, under the weight of something that rewrote existence itself. Even the idea of resistance was an anomaly. The air tightened. Reality flinched. And Q smiled again. "There you are." The invisible pressure pressing against him shifted, recalculating, tightening its grip, not violently, not urgently, but with a cold precision that treated Q like a variable that needed correction. His arm lifted, slowly, every inch fought for. The space around him thickened, like moving through solid glass. Light bent inward, the soundless hum of existence strained, threads of causality stretching to accommodate something they were never meant to hold. "You made one mistake," Q said, voice low, steady, each word landing like a hammer against the silence. The geometric figure paused. Not hesitation, attention. Q's grin sharpened. "You assumed I follow rules." He snapped his fingers. Nothing happened. The silence deepened. The figure didn't react. Didn't need to, because nothing had changed. Q blinked once. Huh. For the first time, confusion. Real. Unfiltered. "All right," he murmured. "That's new." The figure stepped closer. The correction field expanded again, sweeping across the battlefield in a clean, perfect wave. What little remained of the warp's influence was erased entirely. The creature of rage collapsed further, its form compressing, its aura dimming, as if its very concept was being rewritten into something smaller, simpler, irrelevant. The Emperor felt it. His golden singularity flared violently, pushing back against the advancing perfection, not out of aggression, but necessity. If that field reached him fully, even he might not remain what he was. "This ends now," the Emperor said. Not to Q, to it. He moved, not with speed, with inevitability. The singularity collapsed inward, and then detonated, not outward, through. A beam of pure psychic force, condensed, refined, absolute, lanced forward, cutting through the correction field like a blade through fabric, striking the geometric figure dead center. The impact didn't explode, didn't ripple. It paused. For a fraction of a second, the universe held its breath. And then, the beam vanished. Gone. Absorbed. Not reflected. Not resisted. Simply integrated. The figure didn't move. Didn't react. Didn't acknowledge the attack. Q stared. "Okay," he whispered. "That's not fair." The Emperor's light flickered. Not weakened, but challenged. For the first time in 10,000 years. Something had ignored him completely. The figure turned its head. A slight motion, barely perceptible, but it was enough, because now its attention wasn't just on Q. It was on both of them. Q exhaled slowly. "Great," he muttered. "Now we're a team." The Emperor didn't respond, but his presence shifted, subtly aligning, not in agreement, but in necessity. For the first time, they were facing something neither of them could dismiss. The figure raised its hand again. The battlefield trembled, not from force, from revision. The air rewrote itself. The ground smoothed into perfect geometry. The very concept of chaos was being erased, replaced with a single, unified state of existence where everything made sense. And in that perfection, there was no room for anomalies. Q felt it immediately. That same invasive pressure, now stronger, more focused, stripping away layers of his existence, reducing him to something that could be categorized, controlled, corrected. "No," he said under his breath. He pushed. Harder this time. Not casually, not playfully. For the first time since his arrival, Q exerted effort. Reality bent around him, not smoothly, not cleanly, but violently, cracking under the strain of two opposing absolutes. The figure paused again, recalculating, adapting. Q's grin returned, sharp, defiant. "There it is," he said. "You can be pushed." He raised both hands. And this time, he didn't snap. He tore. The fabric of reality split open, not like the warp's chaotic wounds, not like the Emperor's controlled fractures, but something else entirely. Clean, precise, external. A window opened. Not into the warp, not into this universe, but somewhere else, somewhere that didn't follow these rules. The air changed instantly, lighter, sharper, wrong. Q stepped partially through it, anchoring himself in a place where the figure's correction couldn't fully reach. Home field advantage, he said softly. The pressure eased. Not gone, but reduced. Manageable. The figure tilted its head. For the first time, it didn't immediately correct the anomaly. It studied it. Q leaned against the edge of his own tear in reality, looking far more relaxed now. There we go, he said. Now we're playing on even ground. The Emperor watched carefully. This was new. Q wasn't just bending reality. He was changing the playing field. The figure stepped closer to the tear. The correction field reached its edge and stopped, not because it couldn't continue, because it was uncertain. Q's smile widened. Exactly, he said. You don't know what that is, do you? The silence deepened. The figure extended a hand toward the tear, slow, measured, and as its fingers touched the boundary, something happened. Not violently, not explosively, but wrong. The perfect geometry of its form flickered, just slightly. Edges misaligned, angles shifted. For a fraction of a second, the impossible precision of its existence glitched. Q's eyes lit up. Oh, that's interesting. The figure pulled its hand back, not in pain, in recalculation. Q stepped fully back into the battlefield, now anchored between two realities. Now we're talking, he said. The Emperor's voice cut in. You risk tearing this universe apart. Q shrugged. It was already tearing, he replied. I'm just helping it along. The figure raised its hand again, faster this time, more decisive. The correction field surged forward and collided with Q's external anchor. The result was not clean. Reality didn't rewrite. It fought. The air screamed, light fractured. Space folded inward and outward at the same time, creating a zone where nothing could agree on what it was supposed to be. The battlefield became unstable. Dangerously so. The creature of rage seized the moment. It moved, not fully freed, but enough. Its form surged against the weakened correction field, pushing, straining, forcing its way back into relevance through sheer, unrelenting violence. The warp stirred again, faint, distant, but returning. Q laughed. See, he said. Now everyone's getting a turn. The Emperor didn't share the amusement. Because he felt it. The strain, the fracture spreading. This could not hold. The figure adjusted again. Faster now. Adapting to the interference. Recalculating its correction to account for the anomaly Q had introduced. Q felt it immediately. The pressure returned. Stronger. Smarter. Oh, you learn fast, he muttered. He raised his hand again, but this time, he hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, because the figure had already anticipated it. The correction field shifted, targeting the tear itself, attempting to seal it, to remove Q's advantage, to restore a single, controlled reality. Q's eyes narrowed. No, you don't. He pushed harder. The tear widened. The instability increased. The battlefield began to collapse under the strain of two incompatible systems trying to occupy the same space. The sky split into layers. The ground folded into impossible shapes. Gravity lost meaning entirely. The Emperor stepped forward. Directly into the chaos. Golden light surged again, stabilizing what he could, holding the universe together by sheer force of will. But even he was reaching his limit. Q saw it, felt it, and for the first time, understood the stakes. This wasn't just a game anymore. This was a breaking point. "All right," he said quietly. The figure advanced again. Unstoppable. The creature of rage surged. Relentless. The warp whispered. Hungry. And the Emperor held. Barely. Q looked at all of it. Then, he made a decision. "Let's change the rules." He snapped his fingers. Not casually, not playfully, but with intent. And this time, something answered. Far beyond the battlefield, beyond the galaxy, beyond even the reach of the warp, something turned its attention toward Q. Something familiar. Something equal. Q's smile returned. Slow. Dangerous. "Now," he whispered, "this is going to get interesting." The figure paused. The Emperor looked up. The creature roared, and reality held its breath, because whatever Q had just called was coming. The answer did not arrive with light. It arrived with recognition. A ripple moved through existence, not outward, not inward, across, like a memory brushing against something it had long forgotten. The battlefield didn't shake. The sky didn't split. There was no explosion, no sound, no heat. Just a pause. Deeper than the one before. Even the geometric figure hesitated, not stopping, not retreating, but slowing, as if something beyond its calculations had entered the equation. Q felt it first. Of course he did. His smile widened, not with curiosity this time, not even amusement, but relief. "About time," he said softly. The tier behind him, his anchor to somewhere else, expanded on its own, stretching open like an eye waking up. The air that spilled from it wasn't just different anymore, it was familiar, clean, structured, ordered, but not cold like the correction field. This was something else, something that understood control because it was control. The Emperor turned, for the first time. His focus left the battlefield entirely. "What have you done?" Q didn't answer, because something stepped through. It didn't emerge. It resolved. One moment, the space beyond, the tier was empty. The next, it wasn't. A figure stood there. Humanoid. Still. Perfectly composed. No distortion, no flicker, no overwhelming aura that crushed the senses. And yet, everything reacted. The correction field stuttered. The creature of rage halted mid-motion, its aura flaring violently before compressing into a tight, unstable shell. The warp, what little of it dared remain, fell silent again. Even the Emperor's golden light dimmed, not extinguished, acknowledging. Q exhaled slowly. "Now that's better." The figure stepped forward. Not into the battlefield, into reality. And reality adjusted, not rewritten, not corrected, balanced. The chaotic fractures, the collapsing layers, the unstable physics, they didn't disappear. They aligned, as if someone had taken every contradiction and forced them to coexist without tearing each other apart. The geometric entity reacted instantly. Its form sharpened, edges aligning into even more precise configurations. Correction field intensifying as it attempted to overwrite this new influence. The newcomer didn't resist, didn't attack. It simply stood, and that was enough. Q grinned. "Miss me?" The figure turned its head slightly toward him. A small motion. Measured. Calm. "You created an imbalance. The voice wasn't loud, didn't echo, but it carried a weight that made the air feel thinner, sharper, like every word cut a little deeper than it should. Q shrugged. Imbalance is interesting. A pause. You always say that. Q's grin widened. Because I am always right. The Emperor stepped forward. Carefully. You are not of this universe either. The newcomer looked at him, not with curiosity, with assessment. You maintain structure under extreme degradation, it said. Impressive. The Emperor didn't react, but something behind his eyes sharpened. You will leave. The newcomer tilted its head slightly. No, the word landed softly, but the effect was immediate. The correction field surged. The geometric entity acted, fast, decisive. Its hand rose, and the battlefield shifted. Reality compressed into a single point of perfect order, collapsing everything. Q, the Emperor, the creature, the newcomer, into a space no larger than a heartbeat. An attempt to simplify, to reduce, to resolve. Q laughed. Too slow. The newcomer moved. One step. That's all it took. The compression stopped. Not broken, not shattered, balanced. The point expanded again, not explosively, not chaotically, but smoothly, restoring space while maintaining stability. The geometric entity paused. For the first time. It encountered something that didn't just resist it, but matched it. Q clapped once. Now this, he said, is a proper conversation. The creature of rage roared, breaking through its suppression, its aura flaring violently as it lunged toward the nearest target. The newcomer. It struck, full force. A blow that had shattered continents, warped space, forced even the Emperor to commit his full power to counter. It landed and stopped. The newcomer didn't block it, didn't deflect it, didn't even move. The force of the strike equalized, dispersed perfectly across reality, leaving no damage, no shockwave, no consequence. The creature staggered. Confusion, again, not emotion, but disruption, rippling through its form. The newcomer looked at it. Excessive. One word. The creature was pushed back. Not violently, not forcefully. Simply moved. Repositioned to a distance that made sense. Q's eyes lit up. Oh, I like you, he said. The geometric entity acted again. Faster now. Adapting. Its correction fields surged toward the newcomer, attempting to overwrite, to define, to reduce it into something manageable. The newcomer responded. Not by resisting, by adjusting. The two forces met. Perfect order. Against perfect balance. The collision didn't explode, didn't ripple. It locked. A stalemate. Precise. Absolute. Q watched, fascinated. Now this is something you don't see every day. The Emperor moved again. Golden light flaring as he stepped into the locked field, adding his will to the equation, reinforcing reality, stabilizing what he could. For a moment, it worked. The battlefield held. Chaos, order, rage, decay, all contained within a fragile equilibrium. Q looked between them, then at the creature, then at the warp, barely held at bay. Then back at the newcomer. You know what this needs? He said. No one answered. Q grinned. Escalation. He snapped his fingers. And the battlefield shifted again. Not into chaos, not into order, into something else entirely. A third state. One where rules didn't just bend or break. They changed. The ground beneath them became reflective, like liquid glass, mirroring not their forms, but their intent. The The sky fractured into layers of different possibilities, each one flickering between outcomes that hadn't happened yet. Time itself split, moments overlapping, repeating, diverging. The Emperor's gaze hardened. "You endanger everything." Q shrugged. "That's the point." The geometric entity reacted instantly, recalibrating its correction to account for the new variables. The newcomer adjusted as well, maintaining balance across the shifting layers. The creature of rage surged, feeding on the instability, growing stronger with every fracture. The warp watched, waiting. Q spread his arms. "Welcome," he said, voice filled with something dangerously close to excitement. "To something new." The battlefield trembled, not collapsing, evolving. And for a moment, everything held. Then, it broke. The reflective ground shattered upward, turning into a storm of razor-thin fragments that sliced through space itself. The layered sky collapsed inward, merging possibilities into contradictions that couldn't coexist. The geometric entity surged. The newcomer countered. The Emperor pushed harder. The creature roared louder. And Q stood at the center of it all, laughing. But then he stopped, because something else moved, not from the warp, not from his reality, not from anywhere they were aware of, something that had been watching, waiting, learning, and now acting. Q's smile faded. "No," he whispered, because this wasn't something he had called. This wasn't something the others had summoned. This was something that had been drawn here by everything they had done. And it was hungry. The first thing it consumed was motion. Not slowed, not halted, not reversed. Removed. A falling shard of glass froze mid-spin, then didn't exist as falling anymore. It simply was in two places at once for a heartbeat, and then neither. A scream began in a soldier's throat, vocal cords tightening, breath pushing, and then the act of screaming vanished, leaving only a silent mouth stretched wide in a memory that couldn't complete itself. The battlefield didn't quiet. It forgot how to be loud. Q's eyes narrowed. That's not just interference. The air thinned, not from heat, not from vacuum, but from lack of events. The smell of rot from the receding green corruption faded, not cleansed, but unhappened. Even the sharp tang of ozone from the Emperor's power dimmed, as if the reaction that produced it had been edited out of the script. And then it stepped forward. No tier, no doorway. It didn't arrive from somewhere else. It entered from nowhere. A shape, if it could be called that, assembled from absence. Edges defined by what wasn't there. A silhouette cut from reality itself, its outline warping not light, not space, but sequence. You could see it, only because everything around it lost the order required to hide it. The geometric entity reacted first. Instant. Precise. Its correction field surged toward the newcomer, toward the absence, attempting to define it, to categorize it, to reduce it to something consistent. The field touched it and vanished. Not canceled, not resisted. The event of touching ceased to exist. The geometric entity stuttered. For the first time, it produced something like error. Q's grin didn't return. "You don't like being undefined," he murmured. "Well, this one doesn't like being anything." The Emperor stepped forward. Golden singularity blazing, edges sharpening to a lethal clarity that made the air scream in thin, high frequencies. He did not hesitate. He did not measure. He acted. A beam, denser than before, colder in its intensity, lanced straight through the absence. For a fraction of a second, the beam existed. Then, it didn't. The Emperor's attack had not been blocked. It had not been absorbed. It had not been deflected. The fact that it was fired unraveled mid-action, leaving behind a gap in causality that snapped shut with a sickening, silent jolt. Across the battlefield, cracks formed, not in stone, not in sky, but in continuity. Moments misaligned. Footsteps completed before they began. Debris landed before it fell. Q inhaled slowly. That's illegal. The creature of rage didn't care. It never cared. It surged forward, violence incarnate, closing distance with a roar that rattled bones and set the remaining air ablaze with friction alone. It struck. Again. The strike never happened. The creature's arm passed through the space where impact should have occurred and emerged after the consequence, as if the cause had been erased, but the momentum remained. The creature staggered, not from pain, from contradiction. Its aura flared wildly, red-hot intensity spiking and collapsing as its own sequence of actions began to destabilize. Q took a step back, carefully. Okay, he said, voice quieter now. We're past interesting. The newcomer, the absence, tilted. Not a head, not a body, a reference point. It looked at Q, not measuring, not analyzing, just selecting. Q felt it. Something deeper than pressure. A pull, not on his body, not on his power, but on his place in events, like a thread being isolated in a tapestry before being cut. No, Q said, sharper now. He snapped his fingers. Reality answered. A cascade of rewrites rippled outward, stars repositioning, gravity reasserting, causality snapping back into place under his command. For a moment, it worked. The absence flickered, edges blurred. A hint of definition threatened to form. Q pushed harder. You don't get to do that here. The geometric entity seized the opening. Its correction field surged in tandem with Q's rewrite, layering perfect order over Q's imposed structure, attempting to trap the absence between two forms of definition. The newcomer, the balanced one, stepped in, a third influence, stabilizing, equalizing, for a heartbeat. Three systems aligned. Control, order, balance. The absence paused. A moment stretched thin as a blade. Q smiled. Not wide, but real. Got you. The Emperor moved. Everything he had left compressed into a single final act. The golden singularity collapsed inward until it was no larger than a grain of sand. And then he released it. Not a beam, not a wave. A decision. Reality agreed. The aligned forces converged on the absence, locking it into a state where it had to exist, had to follow sequence, had to be something. For the first time, it resisted, not actively, not violently, but incorrectly. The alignment faltered, the moment slipped, and then the absence moved, not forward, not backward, between. It stepped into the space between cause and effect, and cut. Q felt it instantly. A sharp surgical removal, not of power, not of form, of continuity. His next thought didn't connect to the previous one. For a fraction of a second, he didn't know what he was doing. The world lurched. The battlefield flickered. The geometric entity glitched harder, its perfect form fracturing at the edges. The balanced newcomer stiffened, its alignment wavering. The Emperor's light flickered, just once. But that was enough. The creature of rage surged again. This time, its strike landed, Not because it broke through, but because the interruption allowed it to complete. It slammed into the center of the battlefield with a force that shattered what remained of stability, sending fractures racing outward in jagged, unpredictable patterns. Mountains in the distance collapsed. Oceans rose into walls of boiling water. The sky split into cascading layers of broken light. Q stumbled. Actually, stumbled. His foot caught on nothing, balance lost for a heartbeat that shouldn't have existed. "No," he said again, breath tighter. The absence turned toward him fully, not focusing, not targeting, just including him. Q's smile vanished completely. "I don't like you." The absence didn't react, didn't need to, because something else was already happening. Q's tear, the anchor to his own reality, shuddered. The edge of it frayed, its clean boundary unraveling as the absence reached toward it, not touching, not interacting, but removing the event of connection that kept it stable. Q saw it. And for the first time, there was urgency. He raised both hands. No theatrics, no jokes, just raw intent. "No," he pushed. Hard. Harder than before. Harder than he ever had. Reality bent around him violently, the tear stabilizing, reasserting its connection, resisting the unraveling. The geometric entity recalculated again, its correction field shifting to account for the new variable. The balanced newcomer adjusted, reinforcing stability where it could. The Emperor held, barely, and the absence continued, unbothered, unhurried, unstoppable. Q's eyes burned, not with amusement, not with curiosity, with something far more dangerous: resolve. "You want to erase the game?" he said, voice low, steady despite the chaos tearing around him. The absence didn't answer. It didn't need to. Q nodded slowly. "Then I change the board." He spread his hands. And for the first time since everything began, he didn't just affect reality. He reached beyond it. The tear behind him exploded outward, not violently, but expansively, flooding the battlefield with something that didn't belong to this universe at all. The air shifted, sharpened, clarified. The rules changed. Again, the absence paused, not stopped, but delayed. Q smiled. Small, dangerous. Round 2. The Emperor looked at him. The geometric entity recalculated. The balanced newcomer adjusted. The creature of rage roared. And the absence tilted, because whatever Q had just done had made even it take notice. And far beyond all of them, something else stirred, not drawn by chaos, not drawn by order, drawn by Q, because he had just reached too far, and something had reached back. The universe flinched, not from impact, not from power, from recognition. The expanding tear behind Q didn't just widen, it stabilized into something else. The edges stopped fraying, the distortion stopped screaming, the impossible geometry of two incompatible realities grinding against each other, aligned. For a single fragile moment, everything became clear. Too clear. The air sharpened, slicing against the skin like cold glass. Every breath burned, not with heat, but with precision, like lungs were being measured, evaluated, corrected on the fly. Even light lost its softness, hardening into rigid beams that cut clean shadows across the broken battlefield. Q stood at the center of it. No grin now, no mockery, just focus. "There you are," he whispered. And then, it answered. The response didn't come from the tear. It came from everywhere the tear touched. The ground beneath Q hardened, not into stone, not into steel, but into certainty. The fractured, overlapping layers of reality snapped into a unified state, not by force, not by correction, but by agreement. The sky stopped flickering. Time stopped stuttering. Even the lingering chaos from the warp, rage, decay, manipulation, flattened into something contained. The absence reacted. Instantly. It shifted forward. No movement, no distance, just closer. The edges of its form blurred further, swallowing events before they could complete, eating the sequence of reality itself. But this time, it didn't advance cleanly. The space between it and Q resisted. Not violently, not aggressively, just refused to be undone. Q exhaled slowly. Good. Behind him, the tear pulsed once, and something stepped through. It wasn't dramatic. No explosion, no shockwave. Just a presence, arriving. A figure, similar to Q in form. Humanoid, upright, composed. But where Q carried chaos wrapped in control, this one carried structure wrapped in inevitability. Its features were right. Too right. Every angle precise. Every movement efficient. Every detail intentional. And its eyes didn't glow. Didn't burn. They simply knew. The battlefield reacted. The geometric entity froze. Not stopped. Paused. The creature of rage recoiled, its aura collapsing inward as if suddenly aware of something it couldn't strike. The Emperor's golden light tightened, condensed further, not in challenge, in acknowledgement. Q turned slightly. You took your time. The newcomer didn't smile. You escalated beyond acceptable parameters. Q shrugged faintly. Acceptable is subjective. The figure stepped forward. No, it said calmly. It isn't. The absence shifted. Its form flickered, not weakening, not retreating, but adjusting. The edges of its non-existence sharpened, pushing harder against the stabilized reality, attempting to remove the very agreement that held things together. The new arrival raised a hand. Not forcefully, not dramatically, just once. The absence stopped, not erased, not blocked, contained. A thin boundary formed around it, not visible, not tangible, but absolute. A line it could not cross, not because it lacked power, but because crossing it would violate something deeper than sequence. Q's eyes lit up again. Oh, that's nice. The figure didn't look at him. It will not hold indefinitely. The Emperor stepped forward. You know what this is. It wasn't a question. The newcomer turned its head slightly. Yes. A pause. Then, it is a termination pattern. The words landed heavy, not dramatic, definitive. Q's smile thinned. I was hoping you'd say something more reassuring. The figure ignored him. It does not destroy. It does not conquer. It removes continuity until existence cannot sustain itself. The creature of rage roared again, frustrated, constrained, its nature demanding conflict it could not properly engage. The geometric entity recalculated, its correction field probing the new boundary, attempting to redefine it. The balanced newcomer adjusted, reinforcing stability across the battlefield. Everything held, barely. Q folded his arms. So what's the solution? The figure looked at him. Directly. You. Q blinked. Excuse me? You introduced variables beyond system tolerance, the figure continued. You will resolve them. Q let out a short laugh. Ah, I see. Classic. Make it my problem. It is your problem. The absence pulsed. The boundary strained. A hairline fracture formed, not visible, but felt. A tension building at the edge of containment, like a glass under pressure that hadn't cracked yet. Q glanced at it, then back at the figure. And if I don't? The answer came instantly. You will be removed. Silence. Even the battlefield seemed to pause at that. Q's grin returned. Slow. Dangerous. You can try. The figure didn't react. Didn't rise to the challenge. Didn't escalate. It simply turned its attention back to the absence and reinforced the boundary. The fracture sealed. Temporarily, the Emperor stepped closer to Q. Your kind brings only instability. Q didn't look at him. Stability is overrated. The Emperor's gaze hardened. Billions are dying. Q's expression didn't change. Billions always die. A pause. Then, but this, he added, gesturing at the containment, the converging forces, the layered realities. This matters. The creature of rage broke through a fraction of its constraint, slamming against the boundary with a force that rattled the entire structure. Cracks spread. The absence pulsed in response. The geometric entity surged again, attempting to correct both disruptions at once. The balanced newcomer adjusted, holding the line, and the figure watched, calculating, always calculating. Q exhaled slowly. All right, he said. Let's do this properly. He stepped forward, closer to the boundary, closer to the absence. The air thickened, not from pressure, from importance. Every movement now mattered. Every action had weight. Q raised his hand. The figure behind him spoke. Do not engage directly. Q ignored it. You said it removes continuity, he murmured, eyes fixed on the shifting void inside the boundary. Yes. Q smiled faintly. Then I just need to give it something it can't remove. The figure paused. A fraction. That is not a valid solution. Q's grin widened. It is, if I'm right. The Emperor stepped forward. You risk everything. Q glanced back. That's kind of my thing. The boundary cracked again, louder this time. The absence pushed harder. The creature of rage surged in tandem. The warp whispered at the edges, sensing weakness. Everything was about to break. Q turned back. Focus sharp. Resolve absolute. Let's see what happens when an unstoppable force meets something that doesn't follow the concept of stop. He stepped through the boundary. The figure moved instantly. Too late. Q was inside. Inside the containment. Inside the presence of the absence. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, everything did. The absence surged. Q's form flickered. Not physically, conceptually. Parts of him vanished. Not limbs, not features, but moments. Actions that had occurred. Undone. Words he had spoken. Unsaid. Thoughts he had formed. Unformed. Q staggered. Actually staggered. Oh, he whispered. The figure outside tightened the boundary, trying to isolate the interaction. Withdraw, it commanded. Q didn't move. Couldn't. The absence pressed harder. His outline blurred, faded. For the first time, Q was being erased. And yet, he smiled. Found you, he said softly. Because in that impossible space, where continuity broke down, where existence lost its sequence, Q saw something. A pattern, a flaw, And as the absence consumed more of him, he reached for it. The moment Q touched the pattern, the absence stuttered. Not visibly, not dramatically. No crack, no flash, no sound. But something, deep in the way it unwrote things, misaligned. A fraction. A glitch in nothingness. Q's hand, half there, half already undone, pressed forward anyway. The air around it didn't ripple. It didn't distort. It simply failed to decide what his hand was doing. "There you are," Q whispered, voice skipping between syllables as parts of the sentence ceased to have been spoken. The absence responded. It surged. Not outward. Through him. Q's chest hollowed, not physically, but temporally. The moment of his heartbeat vanished mid-cycle. Blood stopped existing in motion, hanging between beats that no longer connected. He gasped. Or rather, the idea of gasping flickered in and out. "Okay," he managed, the word breaking apart halfway through. "That's unpleasant." Outside the boundary, the figure moved closer. The containment tightened, layers reinforcing over layers, attempting to stabilize the interaction without collapsing it entirely. "You are degrading," it said. Q didn't look back. "Insightful." The Emperor stepped forward beside the boundary, golden light sharpening into razor-thin lines that etched themselves across reality, anchoring what little continuity remained. "If he fails," the Emperor said, voice low, measured, "everything ends." The figure didn't answer, because it already knew. Inside, Q pushed deeper. The absence didn't have a core, didn't have a center, but it had a habit, a repetition, a rhythm in the way it erased. And Q saw it. Every time it removed an event, there was a gap, a microscopic pause, not in time, not in action, but in decision. A point where something chose to not exist. Q smiled, despite the parts of his face that no longer remembered how to form expressions. "You think," he whispered. The absence pulsed. Faster now. More aggressive. It began removing larger chunks of Q, not limbs, not mass, but sequences, entire chains of cause and effect that defined his presence. He blinked, and forgot why he had blinked. He moved, and didn't remember starting. "Rude," he muttered, though even that word unraveled at the edges. Still, he pushed, because that gap, that decision point, was real, and anything that decided could be influenced. Outside, the creature of rage slammed against the boundary again, its strikes now more erratic, driven not just by fury, but by the destabilizing effect of the absence bleeding outward. The geometric entity recalculated rapidly, its correction field flickering between multiple configurations as it tried to account for a variable that didn't obey definable rules. The balanced newcomer held position, maintaining the equilibrium, but even it was straining now, subtle distortions appearing at the edges of its otherwise perfect composure. "This cannot continue," it said. The Emperor didn't look at it. "Then end it." "I cannot," it replied, "not without removing him." A pause. The Emperor's jaw tightened. "Then we hold." Inside, Q laughed. It came out wrong. Fragments of sound detached from each other, echoing before they were made, overlapping in ways that made no sense. "You're not unstoppable," he said, reaching forward again. The absence surged in response, erasing the moment of his reach before it could complete. But Q anticipated it. He moved between the moments. Not faster, not stronger. Just out of sequence. His hand touched the gap, and for a fraction of something that wasn't time, he felt it, Not a mind, not a will, but a process. A function repeating itself endlessly, consuming continuity, because that was what it was designed to do. Q's eyes lit up. "Oh, you're not a god," he whispered. The absence flickered. "You're a rule, and rules could be rewritten." Outside, the figure's gaze sharpened. He is interacting with it at the structural level. The Emperor's light flared. Can he succeed? A pause. Unknown. Inside, Q pushed harder. The absence reacted instantly, escalating its erasure, stripping away larger and larger portions of his continuity. His past began to blur. Memories flickered. Events that defined him, moments, choices, actions, began to unravel. For the first time, Q felt something dangerously close to fear, not of pain, not of death, but of non-existence. "No," he said, forcing the word to hold together. He reached deeper into the gap, into the decision point, and this time, he didn't just observe it, he touched it. Everything stopped. Not time, not motion, process. The absence paused mid-erasure, its function interrupted. Not broken, not destroyed, but questioned. Q stood in that impossible stillness, his form flickering between existence and non-existence, held together by sheer force of will. "You don't choose," he said slowly. "You execute." The absence didn't respond, but something shifted. Q smiled. "Then I don't need to beat you," he continued. "I just need to redirect you." Outside, the boundary cracked again, louder, wider. The creature of rage surged harder. The warp whispered louder. The geometric entity strained. The balanced newcomer adjusted. The Emperor held. And Q changed the rule. Inside, the gap expanded. Not physically, conceptually. The decision point where the absence determined what to erase widened, slowed, and for the first time, it hesitated. Not by choice, by design. Q forced it. He anchored himself to that hesitation, using it as a foothold in a place where footholds didn't exist. "Let's see how you handle this," he said. He pushed the decision outward, away from himself, toward something else. The absence responded, automatically. It followed the new directive, the new target, the new event. Outside, the battlefield froze, not from the absence, from anticipation. The figure's eyes widened. "No," the Emperor turned. "What has he done?" The answer came instantly. "He has redirected the termination pattern." The Emperor's light flared. "Toward what?" The figure didn't answer, because it was already happening. The absence shifted. Its focus changed. Its function locked onto a new sequence. And then, it began to erase. The target was the boundary itself. The containment collapsed, not broken, not shattered, unwritten. The absence surged outward, no longer constrained, no longer contained, its function expanding across the battlefield with unstoppable precision. The creature of rage roared in triumph. The warp surged back. The geometric entity scrambled to recalibrate. The balanced newcomer strained to restore equilibrium. The Emperor stepped forward. Too late. Q stumbled out of the collapsing boundary, his form flickering violently, barely holding together. "Okay," he gasped, breathing hard for the first time. "That might have been a mistake." The absence spread, faster now, stronger, uncontained. And this time, it wasn't just targeting Q, it was targeting everything. The battlefield, the planet, the system, the very structure of reality itself. The figure turned to Q. "You have accelerated termination." Q wiped his mouth, though the motion skipped twice before completing. "Yeah," he admitted. Then he smiled. "But now I know how it works." The Emperor's voice cut through the chaos. "Then fix it." Q looked at him, at the spreading absence, at the collapsing reality, at the impossible situation he had created. And for a moment, he hesitated. Just a fraction, just long enough for something else to move. From the warp, from the cracks, from the chaos they had all unleashed, a presence surged. Not decay, not rage, not manipulation, not excess. Something worse, something that had been waiting for exactly this moment. Q's smile faded. "Oh, come on." Because now, there was another player. The warp didn't open. It blinked. A single impossible instant where all chaos across reality synchronized. 4 gods, countless demons, screaming dimensions, boiling emotion, all of it snapping into the same direction like a predator finally noticing prey it could not ignore. And then, something stepped through. Not violently, not urgently, like it had been walking for a very long time and had simply arrived late to the moment that mattered. The air around it didn't distort. It obeyed. Gravity didn't bend. It aligned. Even the spreading absence, the termination pattern devouring continuity, hesitated for a fraction of existence. Q felt it immediately. His breath caught. "No," he whispered, because this wasn't part of the system he had pulled apart. This wasn't warp. This wasn't order. This wasn't balance. This was something that treated all of it as a managed resource. The figure from earlier stiffened. For the first time, uncertainty. The Emperor's golden light sharpened into a near-silent point of pressure, reacting instantly to the presence like a blade being drawn halfway from its sheath. Even the creature of rage paused, not from fear, from recognition of something it could not meaningfully strike. The newcomer from before, the balanced one, didn't move, but its alignment wavered. Slightly, like a scale noticing a weight it was never calibrated for, and the geometric entity stopped recalculating, completely, for the first time since its arrival. It had no model, no solution, no correction. The figure that stepped through the warp finally came into full view, and it was wrong in a way that made everything else look primitive. A shape that resembled authority given physical form, not through size, not through power, but through finality. Every detail of it suggested completion, not evolution, not change, completion. It looked at the battlefield the way one might look at a system log that had begun to produce errors. And then it spoke, not loudly, not forcefully, simply. "This sequence is unapproved." The words didn't echo. They overwrote. Entire layers of reality beneath them briefly tried to reorganize themselves around that statement. Q laughed once. Short, sharp, unbelieving. "You gotta be kidding me." The Emperor didn't speak, but his light intensified, carefully, deliberately, as if preparing for something that could not be fought with force alone. The absence, still spreading, paused again. Not because it was stopped, but because it was being observed. The entity tilted its head slightly, as if reading the battlefield like a report. Then it extended a hand, and reality answered. Not violently, not chaotically, administratively. The spreading absence halted, not reversed, not destroyed, paused, like a process suspended mid-execution by a higher authority. The creature of rage roared and tried to move, but found itself unable to progress beyond intent. The warp surged and hit a wall it did not understand. The geometric entity attempted correction and received no input back. The balanced newcomer stabilized instinctively, but even it faltered. And Q, for the first time since this began, stopped joking entirely. "Okay," he said slowly. "This is above my pay grade." The entity looked at him, not with hostility, not with interest, with classification. "You are the source of divergence." Q raised an eyebrow. Rude framing, but technically accurate. A pause. Then, "Correction is required." The Emperor stepped forward. "You will not touch him." The entity turned its attention to him. "You are an unauthorized governing intelligence within a decaying framework." The Emperor's voice dropped. "I am its protector. That designation is not recognized." The moment those words were spoken, the Emperor's presence flickered, just slightly, not weakened, not erased, reinterpreted. Q noticed immediately. "Oh," he murmured, "that's not good." The creature of rage finally broke free of its partial constraint, lunging forward with everything it had left, trying to assert dominance over something it could not comprehend. Its strike landed, and did nothing. Not resisted, not absorbed, just irrelevant. The entity didn't even acknowledge it. It simply updated the state. The creature froze mid-motion, not stopped, reclassified. The warp surged again, and was flattened into a non-variable. The geometric entity attempted to reassert correction, and was assigned a null state. The balanced newcomer stepped forward, and paused mid-step, because even balance requires recognized parameters, and there were none left. Only Q remained fully unresolved. The entity turned toward him again. "You will be reintegrated." Q exhaled slowly. "I don't like that phrasing." The tear behind him, the one he had used as an anchor, began to flicker, not collapsing, not expanding, being indexed. Like something being cataloged for removal or assimilation. Q felt it, deeply. For the first time since arriving, he was not an observer, not a disruptor. He was a line item. "All right," he said quietly. "That's enough of that." He snapped his fingers. Nothing happened. The entity tilted its head. Attempt denied. Q's smile returned, but now it was thin, controlled, focused. "You think you're the only one who can override rules?" He raised both hands. The Emperor watched carefully. The entity remained still. And then, Q spoke. "Not to them, not to the battlefield, but to something beyond it." "Okay, you saw it. You're welcome. Now fix your mess." The air changed. The tear behind him stabilized violently, locking into a form that didn't belong to warp, chaos, order, or balance. Something else. A pressure responded, not arriving, acknowledging. The entity paused. For the first time, uncertainty. External arbitration detected. Q smirked. "Yeah, hi?" The Emperor turned sharply. "What have you done?" Q didn't look at him. "I told you," he said softly. "I escalated." The entity took a step forward and stopped, not by force, by instruction. A new layer of authority descended, not visible, not physical, but absolute in its implication. The battlefield froze again. Not chaos, not order, not balance, but review. And in that stillness, a verdict began to form. The entity did not move. The warp did not whisper. The creature of rage did not roar. Even the absence paused its expansion. Everything waited. Q exhaled. Now we find out if I broke something important. The Emperor looked at him, and for the first time, did not know what came next. The verdict finished forming, and reality prepared to respond. The verdict didn't speak. It executed. No sound, no light, no announcement. Just a single, universal decision rippling outward from nowhere and everywhere at once, like reality itself had been reviewed, annotated, and stamped with an outcome that could not be appealed. For one terrifying instant, everything was still. Then, the battlefield split into 3 layers. Not physically, not visually, existentially. Layer 1, what should exist. Layer 2, what is currently existing. Layer 3, what is permitted to continue existing. And none of them matched. Q felt it immediately. His smile vanished completely. Oh no. The Emperor's golden light surged reflexively, but instead of reinforcing reality, it hit an invisible ceiling, flattening against Layer 3 like a wave crashing into unyielding glass. Denied. The creature of rage roared, but its roar never entered Layer 2. It existed in intention only. The warp surged, and was filtered, reduced, edited. The geometric entity attempted correction, and found its function suspended pending review. The balanced newcomer stepped forward, and stopped mid-motion, locked between existence and authorization. Everything was waiting, except Q, and the entity from beyond the warp. It stood unchanged, observing the divided layers as if they were a system report that had just returned inconsistent data. Then it spoke. Deviation confirmed. Q exhaled slowly. Yeah, I noticed. The entity turned toward him. Source remains unresolved. Q raised an eyebrow. That's me. Hi. Still here, unfortunately. A pause. Then, containment required. Layer 3 shifted. The permission layer tightened. The air around Q compressed. Not violently, not aggressively, administratively. Like reality itself was filing him under unacceptable variants and preparing to archive him out of existence. Q grunted. That's getting old. He pushed back. And for the first time, it didn't work. Not fully. His resistance registered, was acknowledged. And then, overwritten, Q staggered. Actually staggered. His form flickered, edges of him missing for fractions of time, returning out of sync, like a corrupted file trying to reload itself incorrectly. The Emperor moved. Golden light surged toward Q, and stopped at Layer 2. Blocked. Not by force, by rule. The Emperor's voice sharpened. This is not reality, the entity replied instantly. It is corrected reality. Silence. Even the warp felt it. Even the absence paused its expansion. Q laughed once, short, strained. Corrected by what authority? The entity turned slightly. Final layer authority. That did it. Something in the battlefield tightened. Not physically. Conceptually. The idea of final pressed down on everything like gravity without mass. Q felt it again. That delay. That fraction of hesitation in his own existence. And this time, it wasn't just him. The Emperor felt it. The creature of rage felt it. The warp itself bent under it. Even the geometric entity flickered. Q wiped a hand across his face, as if trying to clear static from his perception. Okay, he muttered. That's cheating. The entity raised its hand. Layer 3 responded instantly. Q began to fade, not into nothing, into non-approval. Moments of him were being flagged as non-compliant and removed from continuity. His voice stuttered, his presence fractured. But he smiled again, thin, dangerous. "You're making one assumption," he said. The entity paused. Q looked up directly at it. "That I exist inside your system." A flicker, the first real hesitation. The Emperor's gaze sharpened. But Q wasn't looking at him anymore. He was looking at the tear behind himself, the one that had started all of this, the one that had been stabilized, indexed, and partially reviewed. "You think I opened a door," he said softly. "But I didn't." The entity's head tilted slightly. Q raised a hand toward the tear. "I just made sure you noticed it." And then he pulled. Not physically, not forcefully, but conceptually. He pulled on something behind the tear, something that had been watching since segment 1, something that had responded, something that had already passed judgment once. The tear expanded violently. Layer 3 flickered. For the first time, the entity reacted. Interference escalation detected. Too late. Too slow. Because something stepped through the tear again. Not an arrival. Not an introduction. A correction to the correction. The air collapsed into alignment. All 3 layers snapped. The Emperor's restriction vanished. The creature of rage roared back into full existence. The warp flooded in like a broken dam. The geometric entity resumed function instantly. The balanced newcomer stabilized, and the entity from beyond paused. For the first time, not in control, Q stood there, breathing hard, barely stable, but smiling again. "Yeah," he said. "That's what I was waiting for." The new presence wasn't bigger, wasn't louder, wasn't more overwhelming. It simply looked at the entity of final authority and treated it like an incomplete report. Then it spoke. "This review is invalid." Silence. The entity stiffened. "Authority conflict detected." Q exhaled, almost laughing. "Oh, this is going to get messy." The Emperor turned toward Q. "You summoned a higher arbitration layer." Q shrugged. "Technically, I nudged it." The entity attempted to assert control again. Layer 3 reformed. But now, it wasn't alone. The newcomer's presence expanded gently, not aggressively, but absolutely, overriding the final layer not by force, but by priority. The entity froze. For the first time, it was being evaluated. Q looked between them all, then at the collapsing battlefield, then at the warp surging, then at the Emperor. "You know what the worst part is?" he said quietly. The Emperor didn't respond. Q smiled faintly. "I think I made something that actually scales." The new presence finished its assessment and issued its response. Not a command, not a verdict. A rewrite. The battlefield shook. All layers collapsed into one. Reality reformed, but differently. Not corrected, not erased, not balanced. Reauthored. The entity of final authority flickered. Appeal initiated, and for the first time since Q entered, Warhammer 40K, something above even gods, hesitated. Q looked up at the collapsing structure of rewritten reality and whispered, "Now let's see who gets to stay." Reality didn't explode. It recompiled. Like a universe forced to reboot while still running, stars stuttering mid-orbit. galaxies blinking between configurations that didn't agree on their own histories. Entire wars across distant sectors rewound a fraction of a second, then resumed with different outcomes already written in. The warp didn't roar. It lagged. Even the Emperor of mankind felt it, his golden presence flickering like a signal struggling to stay connected to a network that had just changed its protocol without warning. And Q just stared at it. "Okay," he said quietly. "That's definitely new. The entity of final authority, the one that had been overwritten, challenged, and now appealed against, didn't vanish. It didn't retreat. It simply stopped asserting dominance. For the first time since it arrived, it was waiting for instructions above itself. The newcomer, the one Q had pulled through the tear, stood at the center of everything. Still, calm, unmoving, not reacting to the warp, not reacting to chaos, not reacting to the Emperor, just observing the rewritten structure of reality as if it were a system that had been unexpectedly escalated beyond its original permissions. And then, it spoke again. "This configuration is unstable." Q let out a short laugh. "Yeah," he said. "Welcome to the club." The Emperor stepped forward, carefully, this time not resisting, not attacking, observing. "You are not of this hierarchy," he said. The newcomer turned slightly toward him. "No." A pause. Then, "I'm above it." Silence. Not dramatic silence. Structural silence. The kind that happens when something foundational is acknowledged as being insufficient. The warp shifted uneasily. Even the creature of rage hesitated again, not from fear, but from inability to locate where violence should be directed. The geometric entity attempted to recalibrate, and found no stable frame to recalibrate into. Q exhaled slowly. "Okay," he muttered. "So now we're dealing with that level." The newcomer raised a hand. Reality responded instantly. Not violently, not obediently. Synchronously. The battlefield restructured itself into a single coherent state, not erasing chaos, not erasing order, but aligning them into a unified system where contradictions could exist without breaking anything. The warp stabilized. The Emperor's light stabilized. Even the creature of rage stopped collapsing reality simply by existing. Everything held. For a moment, Q looked around, then smiled faintly. "I've seen universes try to fix themselves before," he said. "This is a new approach." The newcomer glanced at him. "You introduced recursive instability into a closed multiversal framework." Q nodded. "Yeah, that sounds about right." The entity of final authority flickered again, still waiting, still suspended. And then, above all of it, something responded to the appeal. Not the warp, not chaos, not order, not balance. Something external to all classification. The sky didn't open. It didn't crack. It simply became transparent. For a fraction of a second, everyone saw something beyond the battlefield, beyond Warhammer, beyond universes. A structure, infinite, layered, silent, and aware. Q's expression changed instantly. "Oh," he whispered. The Emperor saw it too. His golden presence tightened, not in fear, but in recognition. "That is not a god," the Emperor said quietly. The newcomer nodded once. "No." A pause. Then, "It is the framework." Silence fell across everything. Even the warp didn't move. Even chaos didn't whisper. Even rage didn't roar. Because above all gods, above all systems, above all authority structures, There was something that defined whether any of it was allowed to exist at all, and it had noticed the anomaly. Q. The creature of rage suddenly flickered. The warp pulsed once. The geometric entity froze. The Emperor's light dimmed slightly. And Q, for the first time since this began, looked very, very small. I think I might have overdone it, he admitted softly. The framework did not speak. It did not need to. Instead, a single directive formed across all layers of reality simultaneously. Not a command, not a judgment, a correction request. And it was directed at one thing. Q. The newcomer turned toward him. You are flagged for resolution. Q blinked. Yeah, I gathered that part. The Emperor stepped forward. You cannot survive that. Q shrugged faintly. Not the first time I've heard that. But there was tension now. Real tension. Because this wasn't the warp. Not chaos. Not Imperium willpower. Not even whatever the entity of final authority had been. This was the system that allowed systems to exist. And it was now focused entirely on him. The warp began to unravel again, but differently this time. Not chaos, not corruption, deletion. The creature of rage roared, but its roar failed to propagate. The Emperor's light flared, but it couldn't anchor anything outside of itself. The newcomer tried to stabilize, and was partially ignored. Q took a slow breath. Okay, he said. New rule set. He looked up at the framework, then smiled again. Not playful, not amused, but sharp, focused. Let's negotiate. And for the first time, the framework paused. The pause wasn't mercy. It was processing. Across every layer of existence, the framework did not consider in any human sense. It evaluated Q the way a universe evaluates a paradox, something that either must be resolved or redefined. And then it responded, not with sound, not with form, but with revision pressure. Reality around Q began to compress inward again, not violently, but absolutely, not crushing him physically, erasing the conditions that allowed his continued narrative to remain valid. His voice stuttered. Okay, yeah, this is... Half his sentence failed to exist. He blinked, and the blink didn't complete in time. For a fraction of impossible continuity, Q stopped being a coherent sequence. The Emperor moved instantly. Golden light surged forward like a blade of will, striking the compression field, not to break it, but to anchor it. You will not erase him, the Emperor said, voice low, cutting. The framework did not acknowledge him. It didn't need to, because the Emperor was not part of the correction target. He was collateral. The creature of rage roared again, slamming into the field. But its motion never resolved into impact. It simply attempted to strike, then found itself mid-intent, looped, denied completion. The warp surged and collapsed halfway into itself. Even chaos was being edited now. Q staggered forward through the compression, barely. Pieces of him missing in inconsistent places. Memories half-loaded, thoughts buffering, existence skipping like a corrupted recording. All right, he muttered, voice breaking twice. That's rude. The newcomer stepped forward, calm, still. It extended a hand, and reality aligned. Not resisted, not countered, aligned. The compression field halted, just for a fraction of a second, but that fraction was enough for Q to stabilize his footing in existence again. The framework reacted immediately. Revision pressure increased. The pause ended, and Q flickered harder. The Emperor turned slightly. This is not sustainable. Q laughed weakly. Yeah, I noticed that part too. The newcomer looked at Q. You cannot continue as an unresolved variable. Q wiped his face, except the gesture only partially existed. You all keep saying that like it's a personality flaw. The framework responded. Not with words, with options. 3 of them, appearing across reality like invisible verdict cards. Delete Q, resolve anomaly. Isolate Q, contain divergence. Rewrite Q, convert anomaly into compliant structure. The battlefield went silent again. Even the warp stopped struggling. Even rage paused. Even the Emperor's presence dimmed slightly, not from weakness, but from recognition of scale. Q stared at the options, then tilted his head. Oh! A faint smile returned. Those are terrible choices. The framework did not react. It didn't care for judgment, only resolution. The newcomer spoke quietly. You are out of acceptable outcomes. Q nodded slowly. Yeah, he said. I got that part. A pause. Then he looked up, directly, not at the Emperor, not at the newcomer, not at the warp, at the framework itself. You know what's funny? He said. I've been inside universes that think they're absolute before. The compression tightened. His sentence fractured. He continued anyway. And they all forget the same thing. The Emperor watched him carefully. The newcomer remained still. Even the framework waited. Q raised a hand. You don't actually know what I am. The options flickered. For the first time, uncertainty. Not emotional, structural. Because that statement introduced a variable it could not immediately classify. Q stepped forward into the compression, letting it hit him fully this time. Letting it strip him further. Letting pieces of him fail to load. And still speaking through it. I didn't come here from your system, he said. I came here from outside it. The framework reacted. Revision pressure spiked, but slower, less certain. The newcomer's eyes narrowed slightly. The Emperor's light sharpened. The warp stirred again, not chaotic, curious. Q smiled faintly. And that means you don't get to decide what I become. The compression increased again, but now it hesitated between the 3 options. Delete, isolate, rewrite. All of them failing to resolve cleanly, because Q was not stabilizing, and not fully collapsing. He was refusing categorization. The framework escalated. A 4th option formed. Not displayed, not declared, just implied. Override origin instance. The moment it appeared, everything tightened. Even the Emperor felt it. Even the newcomer. Even the warp. Q exhaled slowly. There it is. The pressure surged. And this time, Q didn't resist. He stopped trying to exist as a form. And instead, he shifted. The framework registered it instantly. Anomaly reclassification attempt detected. But too late. Q's voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere at once. You keep trying to solve me. A pause. And then, but I'm not the problem. The compression snapped downward and hit something behind him. Something that had been waiting since segment 1. The tear. Not the one he opened. The one that had opened him. And for the first time, the framework registered something it could not compress. Not Q, but what he was connected to. The newcomer stepped back slightly. That was not part of this system, it said quietly. The Emperor's eyes narrowed. What is behind it? Q smiled. Wider now. Genuinely. The answer. The framework attempted to revise. Failed. attempted to delete, failed, attempted to rewrite, failed, and for the first time since existence began, it encountered something it could not classify as an outcome. Just as the tear widened, and something on the other side began to look back, the tear didn't open. It noticed them. That was the difference. Not a portal, not a breach, not a gateway, a gaze. Across all layers, across all frameworks, across all attempts to define reality as stable, the thing behind the tear simply became aware of being observed, and the observation returned. Instantly, the framework froze, not stalled, not delayed, interrupted. Every directive, every correction, every attempt at classification simply stopped mid-execution, like a sentence that forgot how to finish itself. Q felt it first. His expression softened, not relief, not triumph, recognition. "Yeah," he whispered. "That's the one." The Emperor's golden light dimmed slightly, not in weakness, but in recalibration. Something older than his domain was now present in the equation, and even his authority instinctively adjusted. The newcomer didn't move, but its composure changed. Subtle. Like a system realizing it had just been placed inside another system it was not designed to interface with. The warp went silent, not calm, not peaceful, absent. Even chaos refused to exist under that gaze. The creature of rage tried to roar and found no pathway for expression. The geometric entity flickered, attempting to define what it was seeing, and failed. Completely. The framework, the entity that had issued correction, revision, and termination, attempted to reassert authority, but its options didn't appear, not deleted, not blocked, ignored. Q exhaled slowly. "You really picked a bad moment to escalate me," he said softly. The tear widened again, not violently, not structurally, naturally, like something behind it had simply decided it had been looking long enough. And now, it was stepping closer. The air changed first, not temperature, not pressure, relevance. Everything that mattered began to feel less important. Everything that didn't matter began to feel equally important. The hierarchy of existence itself bent sideways, unable to prioritize anything in its presence. The Emperor stepped forward instinctively. "You are not part of creation." A pause. Then, a response. Not a voice, not language, but understanding placed directly into perception. "Creation is part of me." Silence. Not imposed, not forced. Just absolute. Even Q stopped smiling for a moment. "Okay," he muttered. "That's actually worse than I remembered." The newcomer shifted slightly. For the first time, uncertainty. "Identity undefined," it said quietly. The framework attempted one last assertion, a final override. But the moment it activated, it was noticed, and that was enough. The attempt collapsed before execution, like a thought corrected before it could become action. Q looked at the tear fully now. "You weren't supposed to get involved," he said. A faint pause. Then, the reply came again, not in words, but in structure. "You opened the interface." The Emperor turned toward Q sharply. "What is it?" Q didn't answer immediately, because, for once, he wasn't entirely sure how to explain it in terms that still fit inside this reality. "It's what I used to keep out," he said finally. A beat. "And what I used to make sure didn't notice me." The newcomer's gaze sharpened. "You are connected to it." Q nodded. Unfortunately, the warp flickered faintly, as if trying to retreat further into itself. The creature of rage began to dissolve. Not erased, not killed, but deprioritized into irrelevance. Even the geometric entity began to lose structural coherence. Because compared to this, everything else was local noise. The framework tried one last classification. Origin instance detected. But before it could resolve, the tear widened again, and something stepped closer. Not through, not across. Closer. Reality bent slightly, as if leaning away from it. Q exhaled. Yeah, he said quietly. This is the part where I stop being the biggest problem in the room. The Emperor didn't move, but his voice was lower now. What happens now? Q looked at him, then at the newcomer, then at everything collapsing into relevance around them, and finally, at the tear. Now, he said softly, I think it decides if anything here was ever real in the first place. A pause. The warp went still. The framework ceased all activity. The newcomer didn't move. The Emperor's light dimmed to a controlled point. Even Q stopped joking entirely. And from beyond the tear, something prepared to answer, not with destruction, not with mercy, but with revision of definition itself. The answer didn't arrive. It replaced arrival. One moment, there was anticipation, a build-up, the unbearable weight of something about to cross the threshold. The next, there was no threshold. The idea of crossing was no longer valid. Everything, warp, Emperor, Q, the newcomer, the framework, even the absence of chaos itself, was rewritten into a single unified condition. Observed state. Not alive, not dead, not real. Observed. And in that state, nothing moved. Not because it was frozen, but because motion required a system that allowed before/after. And that concept had been suspended. Q tried to speak. His mouth formed the intent. But the intent never resolved into speech. Instead, it became a possibility that existed and did not exist at the same time. The Emperor's golden light flickered once, then stopped behaving like light. The warp did not vanish. It became unindexed. The creature of rage, the geometric entity, the balanced newcomer, all of them were still present, but no longer distinguishable as entities. Only expressions of the same observed condition, and the framework collapsed inward silently, not destroyed, not overridden, integrated into observation. Then, Q blinked, and this time, it completed. Oh, he said softly. His voice worked again, not because reality repaired itself, but because speech had been reauthorized. He looked around. Everything was still there, but nothing was decided. The Emperor stood beside him, but not as Emperor. The warp existed, but not as chaos. The newcomer stood, but not as authority. The framework was present, but not as control. Even the tear remained, but it was no longer a gateway, just a perspective. Q exhaled slowly. So that's what you are, he said. A pause. And then, from everywhere at once, a response formed. We are what is observed. Q nodded faintly. Yeah, he said. I've met versions of that before. Silence. Not imposed, not broken, just shared. The Emperor turned slightly toward Q. No battle? Q shrugged. Hard to fight something that doesn't let fight exist as a concept. The warp pulsed faintly, but only as an idea of chaos, not chaos itself. The creature of rage tried to manifest, and instead became the idea of aggression. The geometric entity became the idea of correction. The newcomer became the idea of balance. All of them still existed, but only as interpretations. Q looked at his hand, then closed it. "So what now?" he asked quietly. A pause. Then the answer arrived again, softer this time. Not directive, not judgment, just clarification. "The system is stabilized." Q raised an eyebrow. "Because of me?" A pause. "Because of observation." The Emperor spoke carefully. "And the anomaly?" Q smiled faintly. "Still here," he said, then added, "But now I'm not the only one watching." The tier behind them didn't close, didn't expand. It simply remained, a shared point of awareness between something outside everything and everything that thought it was separate. The newcomer looked at Q. "You will remain a divergence point." Q nodded. "Yeah," he said. "I usually am." The warp remained as a possibility. The Emperor remained as authority. The system remained as observation. And Q stood in the middle of it all. No longer an intruder, no longer an error, but something worse. Something that had made the system aware of itself. And somewhere beyond observation, something smiled. Because now, it could finally begin properly. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was settled. Like dust finally choosing where it belongs after a storm that rewrote the shape of the world. Q stood in the center of it all, hands in his pockets again, though the gesture now felt more symbolic than physical. Around him, Warhammer 40K's impossible chaos no longer screamed, no longer collapsed, no longer tried to overwrite itself into dominance. It simply was. The Emperor of mankind remained still, his golden presence no longer burning like a god demanding worship, but holding steady like a ruler who had seen the limits of rulership itself. The warp didn't roar anymore. It lingered as a distant ocean of possibility, no longer invasive, just present. And the newcomer, the structured intelligence that once judged everything as deviation, now existed without urgency. Even the framework above it all, the thing that once tried to correct Q out of existence, had stopped issuing commands. Not defeated, not victorious, just aware. Q looked up at the tear one last time. It was still there, but it didn't feel like a door anymore. It felt like a memory of a door. He exhaled slowly. "So that's it," he muttered. No one answered, because there was nothing left to correct. No anomaly left to remove. No system left to enforce. Only coexistence. The Emperor finally spoke, voice quieter than before. "What are you then?" Q paused. For once, no smirk, no joke, just a simple truth that didn't need expansion. "Someone who doesn't belong anywhere," he said softly. A beat, then a faint shrug. "But somehow ends up everywhere anyway." The warp remained silent. The gods watched but no longer interfered. The galaxy kept turning, unaware it had been rewritten at the edges of existence. And slowly, the tear began to fade, not closed, not destroyed, just no longer needed. Q turned away first, hands in his pockets, walking, not out of victory, not out of escape, but out of the story that had finished needing him. Behind him, the Emperor did not stop him. The system did not chase him. Nothing demanded he stay, because for the first time in all realities layered upon realities, nothing needed fixing. And Q faded into the thin space between rules, where beings like him always go when the story stops requiring them. Not gone, not erased, just unobserved, and somewhere beyond everything. Something quietly updated the record. Anomaly resolved, system stable, observation complete. The universe continued, as if it had always been this way, as if nothing had ever interrupted it at all. The end.